This is video history from the J. Bay Jacobs Library for the History of Obstetrics and Gynecology in America. It's a pleasant May afternoon in New Orleans in the year 1998. And my guest this afternoon is Dr. Ezra C. Davidson, the 41st President of the American College. Ezra, we're delighted you could come and spend some time with us this afternoon. And let me start out as we do by saying at the beginning, where were you born?
I was born in a small town in northern Mississippi, Water Valley, Mississippi.
And was that where you grew up? Or?
I stayed there until I finished high school, which was principaled by my father, and by the time I finished high school, I finished Davidson High School, which was a segregated high school in Water Valley.
But named after your father?
Yes.
Indeed. Did that name change come while you were there, or was it earlier than that?
No, it came while I was there. As a matter of fact, my father came to Water Valley actually years before my birth, at a time that they were educating blacks to about the 3rd or 4th grade. And he matured that into a high school diploma education level.
Is the school still there?
The school is still there, and it has a very active reunion, which they've had a number of students from that school going into higher education, and they've had very close long-term relationships.
It's a great start in life. What happened after Davidson High School?
Well, then I went to college in Atlanta at Morehouse College for 4 years, where I also developed some very strong personal and ended up professional relations.
You then obviously went to medical school. What attracted you to medicine?
Well, medicine from a professional standpoint was the only attraction I've ever had, believe it or not. I had a very close relationship with my grandfather, who lived across the street from me from my birth until he died about 5 years of age. And he spoiled me in a way that grandparents usually do. And during the last year of his life, he moved across the street and moved into our house, chronically ill. And I saw the physicians making house calls to him. And it was really a very short leap in my mind to do something for anyone that would help my grandfather.
An impression from less than 5 years old.
I think once I said I wanted to go into medicine, I never had a chance to say anything else.
And your medical school after graduation at Morehouse was where?
Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee.
A distinguished school with a great history of its own, indeed.
Oh, yes.
I won't even ask you when you graduated, but we'll...
Well, I did.
All
I
right.
graduated in 1950.
And what then? You obviously went to obstetrics and gynecology. What pushed you in that direction?
Well, actually, when I finished medical school, and if I had to rank the disciplines, obstetrics and gynecology would have been last. I actually wanted to be a surgeon. However, I was in the junior Air Force medical program. I'd been in the service since a junior in medical school. And after my internship in San Diego in Southern California, I went into the Air Force as a general medical officer and was stationed in Japan at a 100-bed hospital that had all of the specialties. And generally, in the major services, there were 2 men servicing, one a fully trained individual and a general medical officer or someone of a more limited training. And in that circumstance, I got kind of co-opted into doing obstetrics and gynecology with an extremely well-trained, well-disciplined, fully trained individual who at one point had been attracted to academic medicine. And that just changed my view of the spectrum of obstetrics and gynecology, and that is a decision that I made that I have never lived to regret. I've really enjoyed it.
None of us have lived to regret that. So, you served 2 years
Oh, no,
or longer than that?
I actually served 4 years in the Air Force. 3 of those were in Japan, and the final year was in Northern California, the large Air Force hospital at Travis Air Force Base outside San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. And what then? By this time you were probably thinking about residency training.
Yes. I had, obviously at that point, an unusually rich obstetric and gynecologic experience. As a matter of fact, in the Air Force, I was actually being assigned as a specialist, though I had not done my specialty training.
3108D, I think it was.
Yeah. Well, however, when I decided to do a residency at the end of that Air Force training, it actually represented one of the major disappointments in my life. I wanted to go into academic medicine, I'm sure largely influenced by the fact that both my parents were educators. And I applied to the better residency programs in the United States, having finished medical school with the AOA, Honor Medical Society, obviously a rich personal history and maturity in obstetrics and gynecology. And I got into none of those programs, and most of them did not even answer my letter. Fortunately, I got a residency program at Harlem Hospital in New York City, which I completed, and then from there did some postgraduate training in blood coagulation at Columbia University, which led me into my academic career.
Who did you work with at Harlem Hospital and at Columbia? And probably names we'd remember.
Well, actually quite a number. At that time, Donald Swartz had just come from Canada as chair at Harlem, and that was the beginning of the public hospital and the university affiliations in New York. So Harlem became affiliated with Columbia University. Harlem had been famous for the Posner brothers as being chairman and also the principal clinicians. Also a famous Dr. Falk had been there, which has several gynecological procedures named after him.
I didn't realize that.
And so Harlem had a long tradition of training a lot of very well-trained and very known obstetricians, gynecologists before my arrival.
Who did you work with then at Columbia, or was it the same staff?
No, I did a fellowship after 3 years of training, and I worked with Louise Phillips. You may remember.
I do.
Who was very prominent, though not a physician, but PhD, clinical researcher, and concentrated on blood coagulation in obstetrics and gynecology at a time when abortions were still illegal in the United States and deranged coagulation mechanisms contributed to the high mortality associated with septic abortions and its complications. And it is because of that clinical experience while as a resident at Harlem, I got interested in blood coagulation and started my academic career in that direction. So I did a fellowship with her at Columbia and stayed on Columbia in the faculty there.
For how long a time were you there?
I went to Columbia University in 1966, and I stayed on the faculty and staff at Columbia until 1971 when I came to Los Angeles with the development of the Drew University and the King Drew Medical Center.
Could you tell us something about that? Because I think it's its own fascinating story, but who were the powers behind starting it, and what role did you play as it began?
Well, that's probably the most important professional decision I've made to go to Los Angeles. In part, it was difficult because I was fairly well situated in New York with a very good research staff in blood coagulation, and in the context of that time was well funded and well situated, and the opportunity for an entirely new school to to be developed in South Central Los Angeles, which really was generated by the Watts riots and the lack of health services in that part of Los Angeles that directly led to the development of the King Drew Medical Center and at that time the Drew Postgraduate Medical School. And I was recruited to be the first chairman of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and actually was about the second or third chairman that was recruited for the institution. So I went to Los Angeles actually before the hospital opened, and I had the rich and intense and varied experience of organizing a completely new hospital and departmental staff and growing that, as you know, to at one period of time was one of the 10 largest obstetrical services in the United States.
Was UCLA a parent in any way of the King Drew Medical Center, or did that come later?
Well, actually, both USC and UCLA participated in the early development of the King Drew Medical Center and the Drew University. The deans of both those schools actually were on the original board of directors, and they still hold seats as ex officio positions on the school. So the King Drew Medical Center and the Drew University benefited richly from the associations with USC and UCLA.
Of course, we all remember you for your long involvement there, but you obviously rose to prominence in the American College as well. How did you get involved in organized obstetrics and gynecology, we might call it?
Well, that actually started while I was still in New York. My first exposure, actually, with the American College is that I gave a paper on coagulation in 1968 to the District 2 meeting that was in Puerto Rico. I remember that well. In the next year, I gave a paper at District 2 meeting that was in Toronto, I think.
District 2 never stayed home, did they? They always left New York.
Much to their credit.
Yes.
And I think about 1969, I also I made a presentation at the annual clinical meeting of the American College of Obstetrics, Obstetricians and Gynecologists. My formal activity with the structure of the college actually began in 1975 when I was on the Healthcare Delivery Committee. And a couple of years after that, I was on the first Healthcare Commission when the college reorganized into the Health Commission and the Commission on Education. And after that particular period of time, there was a number of involvements and a number of new directions that were directed by that commission. A couple of years later, I chaired the task force on adolescent pregnancy that made a number of recommendations that sat quietly for several years.
Until the time came. Right?
Yeah, until the time came and the college developed a permanent standing committee which exists until today on adolescent pregnancy. And also, about 5 or 6 years later, as I reviewed things, looking and anticipating this taping, I chaired another task force on underserved women, which ultimately led to a permanent committee which still exists in the college on underserved women. I think those were two important additional structures in the college's history.
Now then you went to elective office. When you were elected secretary, when was that?
That was 1983.
83.
And I actually served 2 terms, 6 years as secretary of the college. I actually feel, in many respects, that those were the richest, most rewarding years in many regards in the college. I think that the college position as secretary is probably much more important than many people recognize.
I think many of us remember you well for when people said, you understand exactly what I just said. You would say, no, we don't. Express it in words. Passing on beyond the secretarial level, then, tell us about your presidential election.
Oh, yeah. Well, I had the great fortune of being elected president-elect right after I finished my tenure as secretary. And the most important thing to me about that opportunity was the chance to use that position to influence the development and focus on another program having to do with fetal and infant mortality reviews, to provide obstetricians and gynecologists an opportunity in a very tangible way at the local community level to get involved in developing a review activity that would identify contributing causes to both fetal and infant mortality so that they could contribute to a reduction of those unacceptably high rates. And I'm really pleased with how that developed and how it has even continued until this day.
Right till now. And I remember talking to you one day about, you expressed to me your thoughts about what could be accomplished if we really looked at this problem and set up a committee. And so it has been, hasn't it?
Yes, and up until then, and one of the reasons why I was concerned about that is that the problem of infant mortality just seemed too large and amorphous. And this was an opportunity to break it down to a bite digestible size that an individual at a local level could find that he had something to contribute in this regard.
Well, certainly not all of our presidents have left us a legacy that's persisted as long as yours, and I commend you for the thought because it was certainly your idea of beginning the project.
Well, it wasn't exactly totally original to do the reviews, but I think the important contribution was organizing it into a national program and giving people helpful tools so that they didn't have to do everything on a local level themselves, and that we were able to facilitate that on a local level in a way in which it probably would not have been as easily done without it.
Ezra, I thank you for being with us today. I think we've been friends for a long time. You, as I think is evident from your words, overcame handicaps that a lot of people didn't have to in rising up the academic ladder in obstetrics, and your accomplishments are going to live right along with you.
Well, one of the joys of working with the college, in all sincerity, Warren, has been knowing and working with you.